another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, send them to am950radio.com. So on today's show, we're going to talk about the 24th Amendment, as we're getting close to finishing those. I'm going to talk about more on Republican fascism, since, there's just no way around it. It just keeps happening. And then finally, I did a little more looking at what the Senate is doing to the big, horrible bill. And it's even worse than the House version. So I'm going to talk about that in the third segment. So as we continue our trip through the Constitution, we are up to the 24th Amendment, which was ratified on January 23rd, 1964. So now we've gotten our way up into the 60s here. And this amendment was to get rid of poll taxes in order to vote. For the history of what was going on back then, this is like in the middle of the civil rights movement, that kind of stuff. And black people were still, particularly in the southern states, unable to vote. And there were all kinds of poll taxes in various states. And by the way, in Minnesota, I'll get to that here in a bit too. So that's what this amendment is for. Basically, it gets rid of the poll tax. Now, depending on how you define poll tax, and I'm going to talk about a couple of examples at the end of the segment, but you can make an argument that, well, the Republicans have not gotten rid of the poll tax. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So basically, what a poll tax is that, like, in order to vote, or in some states, in order to register to vote, you had to pay a tax. So like in some states, you had to like prepay before you could vote. Like you had to register and pay it at that point. So basically, you had to pay a fee. Now, in most states, it was between $1 and $2. But back then, at the time that this was going on, that was a lot of money for people. And a lot of people couldn't afford to do it. The poor people weren't able to do it. So if you weren't able to pay this tax, you were not able to vote. You were not able to vote in state elections. You weren't able to vote in local elections, and you weren't able to vote in federal elections if you could not pay that tax. So this was a way, these poll taxes, as well as literacy tests and a few other things that the southern states did, was a way around the 15th Amendment. Remember, the 15th Amendment was the one that basically said a citizen could not be denied the right to vote based on race. That was passed after the Civil War. So what a bunch of the southern states decided to do was they started adding in poll taxes, which applied to everybody, right? White people too. So poor white people couldn't vote either, unless they came up with the tax. So this is what a lot of the southern states did, is they came into court saying, well, hey, this isn't because of race. This is just, this affects everybody. And a lot of the courts back then bought that argument. And so they kept on, that was still a requirement in a number of states. So some states also included what's called a grandfather clause, which would allow more poor whites to actually vote, even if they couldn't pay this tax. They said, well, if your ancestors could vote, legally, we're going to let you as well. As long as they were eligible to vote, before the Civil War, we're going to let you vote too, even if you don't have to pay the poll tax. So again, these are ways to get around the 15th Amendment. And, $1 or $2, or in some states it was $1.50. If you look at what it would cost today, that's roughly, like, if my math is right, around $25 in today's money. in order to vote. Now, let me just ask people out there listening, is like, if the government said tomorrow, you got to pay $25 to vote in the next election in the 2026 midterms, what do you think would happen? You think a lot of people would say, "Oh, sure, here's $25, and when I go vote." I think a lot of people would be very mad about that, and it probably wouldn't pass, or there'd be enough, people, Congress would get rid of it, or who knows. But there would be an uproar in this country if, starting in the next election, you had to pay $25 a vote. Well, that's basically what it was back then. In Minnesota, back in the 1860s, so in 1863, when you were first able to vote in Minnesota, we were a territory before then. But in 1863, Minnesota passed a poll tax of $1. So there were some, what we would think of today as liberal states that also had back then, poll taxes in their states. So basically, what the effect was to reduce black people from voting and Native American people from voting. And yeah, there were some white people who couldn't vote as well, but the overall effect definitely was to suppress the votes of black and Native American voters. And to make things even worse, now you might say, well, what's a buck or two back then, or even $25 today? Well, there are some states who passed a law that said, well, if you didn't pay taxes in previous years, if you didn't pay those poll taxes, you have to pay it all back. You got to pay up all those back poll taxes before they're going to let you vote now. So a lot of people couldn't afford to do that, of course. Because remember, in America, you are not forced to vote. So if you choose not to vote, those states back there, they charge you that tax anyway. And you had to pay it the next time you voted. So a lot of people were suppressed from voting for that reason as well. Now, there were some attempts in the courts to get rid of poll taxes, but it didn't work. There was a Supreme Court case called Breedlove versus Scuttles. This was a Supreme Court decision in 1937 that challenged the poll tax in the state of Georgia. And a unanimous Supreme Court upheld the Georgia law, basically saying, well, elections are run by the states, which they mostly are. We've talked about that before. So states can use laws that don't violate the 19th Amendments. The 19th Amendment being the one where women were able to vote. So the Supreme Court basically said, well, in state elections, you can pass laws as long as they don't violate, explicitly violate the 15th and 19th Amendment. So they found that the Georgia poll tax did not violate that, so it was racially neutral. That's the legal term that a lot of the courts were using back then. Even though the obvious effect was to suppress the votes of the minority groups, they still said, well, it's racially neutral if you look at the words, in the law that was passed. And the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court now in the present time, they would say the same thing. They don't care about the implications on minority groups or who's affected the most by things like this. It's like, well, as long as it's, racially neutral, as long as there's a few white people that can't do it, well, then it's okay. So here is the language of the 24th Amendment itself, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit. It's one of these, it's not that long, but basically it says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote in federal elections shall not be denied by any state by reason of failing to pay a poll tax or other tax. And then the second section, Congress is the entity that enforces this legislation. So a couple of things here. Notice that it says federal elections. Doesn't say state elections, doesn't say local elections. So even after this was passed, there were a lot of states saying, well, we're not going to apply it to federal elections, but we're going to apply it to state and local elections. You got to pay a poll tax for that. I'll get to that here in a minute. So the federal government, remember, only has power over federal elections. So, not surprisingly, this is a loophole that was exploited. So, the Congress, this is one of the amendments where the Congress, had been trying over the years to try and do something about this, but they weren't able to do it. First, they tried to pass a law, a federal law. Remember, you could at least control federal elections. Congress can. But they weren't able to do it, in large part because back before 1975, the filibuster in the Senate was 2/3. So you actually needed 67 senators back then. But in 1975, that was changed to 60, like it is now, under the Senate rule. Until they, get rid of the rule, which, they do on votes, certain votes, like Supreme Court justices, for example. They'll get rid of the filibuster. But they wouldn't here, of course, because the states that opposed civil rights, they filibustered. And they couldn't get enough to overcome that. So you couldn't do a law from Congress. And in order to propose an amendment to the Constitution, remember that Congress has to get 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate to do the proposed constitutional amendment. Well, they had the same issues there. They couldn't get to 2/3. Of course, this is largely due to the racism that was going on in the country back then. So, eventually, as the civil rights movement got stronger and stronger and stronger, it was able to get through Congress in 1962, the proposed amendment. And once it went to the states, then enough states ratified it in January of 1964. But again, the big problem here as well is this only applied to federal elections. So, after the amendment was passed, the state of Virginia, back in that time in the 1960s, unlike the way it is now, but back then, Virginia was a pretty racist state. And they, famously said screw you to the Supreme Court when they did the Brown versus Board of Education decision where you had to integrate the schools. They didn't do it. Well, Virginia passed another poll tax requirement for state and local elections to get around this amendment, right, which only applied to federal elections. So, not surprisingly, a lawsuit was filed. And in 1966, so this was a couple years after the amendment was passed, the Supreme Court, in a case called Harper versus the Virginia Board of Electors, the Supreme Court applied the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and found that the poll taxes, even for state and local elections, were unconstitutional. So at that point, they did what's called selective incorporation. That's a legal term where the Supreme Court would incorporate, through the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights or other amendments to this and made them applicable to state and local governments, where they initially were for the federal government. They were then applying them to state and local governments. So that's what happened in the Harper case in 1966. So basically what the 24th Amendment does is gets rid of the, paying cash before you could vote kind of thing. But here's a couple things that are in the news that arguably, at least, you could argue maybe these are poll taxes. But you still run into the problem of, given who's on the current Supreme Court, you're going to probably run into problems. But first one, of course, first example of maybe it's a poll tax is voter ID laws. So in many Republican states, you can't vote without a specific state ID. And in some of those states, you got to pay for it, yourself. You got to pay to get it. There's also some states where it's, quote, free, close quote. But, your tax dollars are paying for it in those states. Voter ID was challenged not on poll tax grounds, but other grounds, and the Supreme Court has allowed it nationwide. So at this point, we're stuck with them. And of course, the purpose of voter ID laws is not to raise money or not to catch fake people who are trying to vote under someone else's name. voter ID is about voter suppression. Plain and simple. They're selectively picking which IDs are good to use and which ones aren't. So, of course, the ones that typically are used by white people, those are the ones that they pick. The ones that aren't so easily gettable by minority groups or groups that they don't like, they don't accept them because, normally they vote with Democrats. So many voter ID laws suppress the votes of minority groups and Native Americans, right? Or you gotta go through all these hoops just to get your ID. Some of those include you got to get your original birth certificate. Well, many states, when people in their 80s and 90s and even in their 70s didn't have original birth certificates, for example, in some rural areas of the South, they just didn't do it. There's other areas where the original documents, went up in a fire or a flood and they don't exist anymore. Right, and then in some states, of course, you got to pay a fee to get this stuff. And poor people, for a variety of reasons, can't afford it. Or in some cases, they can't find those documents. And then in some states, they will take your gun permit as an acceptable form of voter ID, but they won't take your state college ID that is, issued by the state. So that's just one example. Another one is requiring ex-felons to pay all their debts, related to their prison term or their jail term before they're able to vote. So there are some states who have either passed constitutional amendments to their state constitutions or their legislature has passed laws like Minnesota did recently where ex-felons now are allowed to vote as long as they're, out of jail, but they're still on probation. They can still vote. Well, the state of Florida, for example, the people voted to amend their state constitution to allow ex-felons to vote. And there wasn't anything in there about, you had to, be current on paying all your fines and all your restitution and all your jail fees and, all that stuff. That wasn't part of the amendment. But the Florida Republican legislature passed a law that said, you got to pay all this stuff before you can vote. Okay, because, they're trying to do more voter suppression. Plain and simple. And they assumed more ex-felons would vote for Democrats since the Democrats were the one that were pushing for the amendment, not the Republicans. So Minnesota, they didn't do the constitutional amendment, but they did Minnesota legislature passed a law that is now allowing ex-felons to vote as long as they're not in jail at the time of the election. So the Supreme Court hasn't explicitly ruled that the 24th Amendment doesn't apply to these two issues, but with this current Supreme Court, I'm sure they would, which is probably why there is, a case hasn't made its way up there at this point. Okay, so that is it for the 24th Amendment. So now we got 3 more to go because we have 27 amendments. So we will carry on with that. Next segment here, we're going to do more on Republican fascism. So we'll talk to you on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to our second segment. Today's show of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. Again, if you have any questions or comments, send them to am950radio.com. So a few weeks ago, I said I was going to start I didn't think I was going to have to do it weekly, but lately it's been weekly on fascism and how the Republican Party and the Trump administration are, putting in our face, like it's wide open, right out in the open. Fascism, like some of the way, some of the political scientists talk about it. And I mean, it's just out there. And people, I hear people saying, it's not fascism. That was the Nazis. And we're not doing that in this country. And well, if you just take the Nazi part out of it and you go by what fascism is and you go by what's happening, I think it's pretty clear that yes, the Republican Party and the Trump administration are going down the road to fascism. And we're already there. So I've talked about that the last few weeks on this show, and I'm going to do it again in this segment. So, how did it feel to waste $45 million on Trump's parade for his birthday? Now, it was supposed to be something for the army, but we all know what it was. It was a birthday parade for the dictator wannabe Trump. And it cost us, I've seen various numbers, but $45 million is kind of a common one that was out there for this stupid parade. Now, one good thing that came out of it was nobody was there. There were some estimates of 10,000 or 15,000. Now, the Trump administration came out and said, well, there was 250,000 people there. No, there wasn't. I mean, who are you kidding here? So I'm going to round up to 20,000. I'm just going to double, the estimates for purposes of, at least this particular segment. So let's say it's 20,000. That's still over $2 million per person that actually went to the parade. Is that how you want your tax dollars spent? This was not only a waste of time for these military guys, and you can tell there's a lot of them didn't want to be there. Right? So this was also a great waste of money. From the administration, who claims all the time that they're, trying to cut down government waste. Well, they just wasted $45 million, and, the press is too busy to, report about that. But that's over, assuming there's 20,000 people there, that's over $2 million per person spent that went to see the stupid parade. Now, I didn't watch that much of it. I watched some clips of it because, that's all I can stand of Trump. But, it was really noticeable. He was disinterested at times. He looked like he was sleeping sometimes. And he just looked literally bored, as well as all these other people that were with him there. So he's catching flack for, wasting this money. And, he got up actually once and was saluting the Vietnam veterans who were walking by, which is very ironic because, of course, Trump was a draft dodger of the Vietnam War with his fake bone spurs way to get out of it. So, he wanted so badly to look like a dictator, but it just failed bigly, to use his word. But this is part of the creeping fascism by Trump and the Republicans. This is part of the militarism cog of that definition that I mentioned before. So now that this, was a complete flop of a birthday parade for him, Trump is pissed off now. And he's stepping up more action that I'll get to here in a second. But one thing to remember, this was supposed to be, an anniversary of sorts for the Army. And Trump keeps saying he's, I'm pro-veteran and I'm doing all this stuff for the veterans. And well, what he keeps forgetting to say is he's cutting, and through Doge, 80,000 jobs at the Veterans Administration. Now, how is that pro-veteran? Just something to think about. But again, I expect nothing less from the Republican Party and Trump, where they say these things and, the complete opposite is the truth. Which leads us to the authoritarianism and suppression of opposition cogs of fascism. So I'm going to give you some examples here, some recent ones. So Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem went to California and made a fool of herself there. But what they report it for one day and then it goes away. They're being stenographers for a day and then you hardly hear about it afterwards. But what she said when she was there is that they were there and they're going to stay there so that they can get rid of the socialists who run the city of Los Angeles and who run California. Which is basically a shot at Mayor Karen Bass of L.A. and Governor Gavin Newsom in the legislature, which is mostly run by Democrats in the state of California. So in other words, they're going to stay there so that they can overthrow the elected governments of the city of L.A. and the state of California. Now, there were some protests there, and that's why the Marines were sent in and the National Guard of California. So Something else about this, Pete Hegseth, right? He was just at a Senate hearing the other day, and he was directly asked, well, has the Department of Defense given an order to shoot civilians? And he wouldn't answer the question. He would just say, he just avoided the question. And, even though Trump did order that during a George Floyd protest, like, well, just shoot him in, below the knees or something to that effect. So Hegseth, he didn't even answer the question. So he couldn't even get up there and say, well, of course not. We're not going to shoot civilians. Again, fascism here, suppressing opposition. And it turns out it looks like those protests in California, if the press bothered to be down there and talk to the people that were there and look at the videos that were taken by people who were actually there, the cops, law enforcement were the ones escalating tensions, not the protesters, according to at least the media that were there. And the media that were there, of course, they spent part of their time dodging rubber bullets that were being shot at them and tear gas that was being shot at them. What's more like fascism than that? So, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, I go after them a few times because I'm still waiting for them to ask for a, quote, reporter, close quote, to ask Stauber, Finstead, Emmer, and Fischbach, our 4 House representatives in Congress, if they agree with Noam's statement or if they agree with Hegseth's statement. But, of course, you're never going to have the Star-Tribune ask those questions. And, the Republicans, they're probably not going to answer it anyway. And, given Noam's statement, well, we're going to get rid of the socialists and, basically overthrow the government in California and L.A., has any Republican come out and criticized her for saying that? Well, of course not. That's because they all agree with it. It's really as simple as that. But you're never going to see the Star-Tribune ask them that question. And if you looked at the Star-Tribune lately, there's a lot of stuff in there not written by people from the Star-Tribune. It's a lot of articles from other newspapers. They're just slapping in there, and the sections are getting smaller and smaller. But that's something for another day. Now, imagine if Alejandro Mayorkas, he was Biden's Department of Homeland Security Secretary. And Republicans back then tried to impeach him. Didn't work. But let's say he came out, he went to the biggest Republican city in Texas, and he came out and he said, we're not leaving until we get rid of the mayor and the governor of Texas. Because we don't like them. They're fascists. That would be running 24/7 on Fox Live and every other, right-wing news outlet. And it would be, a lot of time on the so-called Democratic stations, too. Republicans would be yelling to fire him or impeach him. The Minnesota Star-Tribune would be hounding Ilhan Omar all day long, trying to shove a microphone in front of her face saying, do you agree with this? And there would be, if Mayorkas had actually said something like that, there would be some Democrats criticizing him. I think a lot of Democrats would be criticizing him and wouldn't be afraid to say, yeah, fire his ass if he said something like that. But you don't hear a peep out of the Republicans when it's a Republican doing, saying this stuff. But boy, if a Democrat did, it would be, huge news. Big double standard here. Right? Haven't heard anything about Noam's statement here in the last few days. And he probably won't. That's how lazy the mainstream media is. But it doesn't end there. Trump, probably because his parade was a flop, has now directed ICE to go after Democratic cities and liberal cities, because they're sanctuary cities, right? In his mind, these are where all the immigrant criminals are supposedly rampaging through the streets, starting, city blocks on fire and, blah, blah, blah. We've heard this over and over and over again, which, of course, is utterly false. There was like a 3-block area in L.A. L.A. is a big city. 3 blocks is not that big of an area. That's all that was affected by the protest. But L.A. was burning down California's next. So, I've said numerous times before that undocumented immigrant crime rates are actually less than the rest of us, than us regular Americans, as people like to call us. So this whole thing about immigrants running around committing crimes, well, actually, the crime rate is a lot less. All they're doing is trying to get more power, diminish the power of the Democratic Party in the state that he hates the most, probably, but maybe that in New York is probably a close second. He's trying to provoke something here. That's what he's doing. This is what he's going to keep trying to do so that he can invoke the Insurrection Act and declare martial law and deploy more of the military against us and get rid of habeas corpus, so, basically muting the court system. So he's doing all this to suppress his opposition. So, for example, the mayor of Newark was recently arrested and charges were ultimately dropped, but he was taken away in cuffs and had to sit with the handcuffs on for hours. So they dismissed the case against him, but now they charged a black congresswoman, who was also there with him, charging her with assault and obstructing ICE. That's still pending, as far as I could tell. ICE arrested a staffer of a Democratic House member, Jerry Nadler is the House member, for allegedly harboring rioters in her office. A U.S. Senator, Alex Padilla, was forcibly pushed out of Noam's press conference that I mentioned before in a federal building that he has oversight over. And he said he wanted to ask a question, and he was literally thrown out of the room, and they threw him on the ground, and like four whoever, I don't know if they were cops or who, these days you don't know, handcuffed him. And he was taken away. Now, as far as I can tell, there haven't been any charges filed against him yet, but that doesn't mean there won't be in the future. ICE claims that he obstructed and assaulted an ICE agent when he did nothing. If you look at the tapes or the recordings, he didn't do anything. And these ICE agents, a lot of them that are going around doing this, they're still, have their masks on because they know what they're doing is probably illegal. And another reason why their mask is, it makes it harder for people who are wronged by them to identify them so that they can get their ass sued by people. I think Padilla, I think the mayor of Newark, I think this congressperson, and I think this New York City mayoral candidate should sue ICE and Homeland Security and the Trump administration for assault and for false arrest and, whatever other civil actions that they have. Now, they haven't done it yet, but I sure hope somebody does. This New York mayoral candidate was arrested for locking arms with a person that went into his ICE hearing, his immigration hearing. It was dismissed. So in other words, he wasn't going to be deported, and then ICE scooped him up anyway. And this guy was locking arms with him, and he got arrested for doing that because he was obstructing ICE. So, this is no secret that the Republicans and Trump are using law enforcement and the Department of Justice, the government lawyers, to go after their political opponents. It's funny they made this claim that, Biden's doing this, and they're pointing out all the stuff where, he wasn't doing it. But this is what they do. This is what they do. They project the stuff. And then, like I said, when they claim they're not doing something, yeah, they actually are. They are using law enforcement and Department of Justice to go after their political opponents and come up with, yes, I'm using this, trumped up charges against them. But and they don't even care if they're going to lose in court. They arrested that judge in Wisconsin. They don't care if they're going to lose that court. That's not the point. The point is just to make a big spectacle and try and get more and more power. I wouldn't be surprised if they come to Minneapolis, St. Paul at some point with a raid. Because Trump doesn't like Walz, he doesn't like Omar, right? He doesn't like Minneapolis, so he's going to come after him. I mean, he didn't even call, he hasn't even called as far as I know, Walz or anybody else to offer condolences about Melissa Hartman's murder. He actually said it would be a waste of time to call Walz. Now, imagine what would happen if Biden said, I'm not going to call Greg Abbott if there was a similar shooting in Texas. I mean, he would be criticized up and down. Right? Trump's reaction is basically a green light for others to do it, to commit political violence against Democrats. Because this is what he wants. This is what the Republican Party wants. This is another way to suppress opposition and get more power. Any normal president would go on TV and denounce this political violence, say he's sorry for what happened, call for unity, distance himself from the killer, and say that the Department of Justice is going to cooperate, and, standard lines that presidents have used before, but not Trump. He can't do it. He has no empathy, and he just doesn't want to look like he's being nice to Democrats. So instead, he criticizes Walz, calls him a loser, doesn't do anything about this. He's had numerous chances, but he's not going to do it. So he wants this division. He wants this chaos. This is what the Republicans want. What do you expect from a person convicted of 34 felony counts and pardoned all of the January 6ers, who, of course, were doing exactly what Trump wants to do now? So I actually had some people ask me, well, Belter's charged with federal crimes. Is Trump going to pardon him if he gets convicted of these federal crimes? I'd like to say, well, no, he's not going to do that, but who knows with Trump? Right? Who knows? So there we go. Some more Republican fascism at work. Speaking of Republicans, when I come back, I'm going to talk about how they're making the big, horrible bill even worse than the Republican-led Senate. So we'll talk about that on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to the third and final segment of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, send them to am950radio.com. So, you thought that the House version of the big, horrible bill was bad. Well, the Senate's is worse. It would cut billions of dollars more from Medicaid. At least this is the first part. Now there's other parts I'm going to talk about here. But the main thing, what they're trying to do here in the Senate is cut one of the big funding provisions of the program. So I talked about the House version about the Medicaid provider taxes, which is one of the mechanisms they use where they tax the hospitals, they tax the doctors, that use the Medicaid program, practice under that. And then the states can include that money in with what they get reimbursed for by the federal government. Well, the Senate wants to get basically cut that down even more so that particular tax on the hospitals and on the doctors is less, which the result will be, of course, is that the state has less money to pay the hospitals and pay the doctors who provide Medicaid patient care. So the states are going to get less money. So either the states, as I've mentioned before, the states are either going to have to raise their taxes to come up with this extra money that they're going to lose, or they're going to change eligibility standards, or they're going to change what's actually, what they're going to cover in their hospital, or some hospitals are just going to say, okay, we're done with Medicaid. We're not going to get enough money. We're just not going to do it. Or one thing that I suppose the hospitals can do is, cut their rates, but, a lot of them, particularly out in rural areas, aren't really able to do that at this point. So the Senate bill lowers the maximum tax rate from 6% down to 3.5%. Now, it's not an overnight cut, but it's a step cut over a number of years. But still, this is a way, as I mentioned on a previous show, they're trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. by starving the money out of it. And one way they can do it is through Medicaid. Remember, that's part of what the ACA was, is expanding Medicare so that more poorer people can get covered. Well, this is a way that the Republicans want to starve Medicaid in particular to kick people off, as well as the work requirements that I talked about before. A lot of people are going to get kicked off because of that. So the nursing home tax rate is going to stay at 6%, but nothing else. They're going to go down to the 3.5%. Now, the House bill was at 6%. They just kept it at 6%, but not the Senate bill. The Senate bill also eliminates a kind of provider tax on private insurers some states use to administer the Medicaid benefits. So now the insurance companies, they're getting taxed too much. We have to, give them a break. So they are. So states are going to have less money to pay the hospitals. The hospitals, various interest groups representing the hospital, of course, have come out and said, we don't like this, we don't approve it, we don't want it. They're criticizing the Senate bill even more than they're criticizing the House bill. They didn't like it in the House bill either, because they're going to lose significant funding. This is going to lead to hospitals closing, particularly in rural areas. Or if not closing, well, then they're going to cut services, or they're only going to say, okay, we can only take X number of patients in a day. So you got to go somewhere else. Even Josh Hawley, who I hardly ever agree with anything, he's come out against this. He doesn't like to drop to 3.5%. He's even saying, well, there's going to be some rural hospitals in my state, and his state's Missouri, that are likely going to have to close. So he's against it. Now, don't be surprised if something happens like this, where if they really need his vote, the Senate's going to say, okay, this tax doesn't apply to the state of Missouri. Voila, and then Hawley is going to vote for it. Just keep that, in the back of your mind. So here's another addition to the Senate version of the big horrible bill. James Langford, who's a senator from Oklahoma, successfully inserted a tax break to oil and gas companies and oil and gas drillers. Gee, imagine that. Under the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, there was a corporate alternative tax in there of 15% on book profits that you show your shareholders. If you make above $1 billion in revenue, then you got to pay 15%, anything above $1 billion. Well, in the state of Oklahoma, you don't have to pay that, at least if this bill passes, because Langford got an exception put in, because of course he's a lackey for the oil and gas companies. He's taken more than $545,000 in campaign contributions in the last 5 years from oil and gas companies. So you can, again, if it boils down to a few senators here or there, you can expect more carve-outs for other states to get their vote. So you might see, well, maybe Josh Hawley gets, this, I don't know how big oil and gas drilling are in Missouri, but, states where that's a big thing, you can see a carve-out for them too. This bill slashes heating assistance for poor people to help pay for this tax cut. Right? This just gets back to, this is what this bill is. It's a wealth transfer. That's all this bill is. And now the Senate is making it even worse. So another thing is the Senate version is there's language in there requiring the selling off of millions of acres of public lands to help pay for these tax cuts. The bill requires selling off 2 to 3 million acres of public land in 5 years. So these are for national forests that the federal government has jurisdiction over, and the Bureau of Land Management land. You have to sell off 2 to 3 million acres in 5 years. But here's the big kicker. The bill makes more than 250 million acres eligible for these sales. So you can sell off more than the 2 to 3 million acres. That's just the minimum. This bill wipes out any requirement that the government weigh the potential benefits of the land sale against lost recreation clean water, wildlife effects, etc. In other words, they're just going to ignore the environmental effects. It's nothing. It gets rid of all those, environmental studies and all that stuff to sell off the land. This is just another way, a backdoor way for mining companies to get land into boundary waters. All right. And, to make things even worse, no public comment on this, no public interest or input for this bill. They only have to talk with the governmental units, but they're not taking any public comment. They're not doing any public hearings, none of it. From the rest of us, nothing. You don't, and they don't even have to tell the public who bought the land and how much they paid. They like to say, well, we're going to do this to, for affordable housing. No, they're not. They're going to build housing for rich people. But that part's in there too. Another change by the Senate is to keep the $10,000 limit on state and local taxes deduction. Now, the House raised it to $40,000. The Senate just wants to keep it at $10,000. So that's more of a negative on us for people who are eligible for that deduction. And the Senate raised the debt limit. The debt limit is going to go up by over $5 million now. Actually, I think it's $5 trillion now under the Senate bill. So not only that, they're going to create public school choice tax credits. I think I mentioned that before too. So much for the party claiming to be fiscally responsible. But yeah, they love to talk about, the debt limit's too high, and now they're going to raise it. Such hypocrisy. I guess it's okay for the Republicans to do it, but, not the rest of us. So, this is really bad bill, especially for rural areas, for poor people, right? But, everybody needs to get more involved in politics, get more educated on it, to be aware of what the government is doing. You need to take some action. And that's why politics matters. All right, we'll talk to you next week.